Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to chat to you about how I color grade my images. I usually do them in Lightroom. I am not using my presets for this video, so don't worry, this is not a plugin for them. I want to show you step by step about how I would approach color grading an image, how I go about finding the right mood for it and so on. I'm going to be playing with all the settings in Lightroom. If you don't have Lightroom and you only have Photoshop, you can also do it in Camera Raw, but I personally just prefer to do it here in Lightroom. So without further ado, let's get into the video. But before we do, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and click the little bell button to not miss any of my future uploads. And let's get started. Okay, so here we have this image. I took it recently in Bali. The behind the scenes is going to be with us very soon and I'm very excited about it. But yeah, this is the image that I'm going to be working with. It's a really straightforward image. I really love it for many reasons. First, because the greenery is just so beautiful. It balances really nicely with the model's skin tone. So there's a few things that I always start with. I always change the profile first. It's usually on Adobe Color, and you can leave it, but I usually find it's a bit boring. So what I usually do is I go to Browse, and then I do either Adobe Color, which again, boring. I usually would go into the camera profile and either go for the Faithful. The landscape is always a bit more colorful. Neutral is just neutral, as the name suggests. Portrait, Camera Standard. I usually tend to go for Camera Standard. However, kind of depends. There's so many beautiful profiles. The Camera Portrait one looks actually really good for this one. So maybe we'll go with that to just mix it up a bit. Okay, so then we'll close. The next thing that I do, I would go down all the way here to enable profile correction, and I usually do that just because it does change the image a tiny bit. So I'll just click here. As you see, if you like the distortion the way it is, you can just bring it down and keep it as it is, but usually I just do the vignetting just to kind of change it a tiny bit. Once I have that, I actually really like the image already. Once I have that, I am going to start with all my adjustments. So recently my style has been changing quite a lot, and recently I've been really feeling those kind of slightly faded tones. So what I would usually do is I would go into highlights and shadows first. I don't think I need to adjust the exposure because it is pretty nice and bright. Maybe a tiny bit, maybe plus 20, let's say. And now I'm going to go into highlights and shadows, and usually what I like to do is make the highlights a tiny bit muted and the shadows a bit brighter as well, so they're not as harsh. So I'll go down into highlights and bring the highlights down. As you see, you get kind of a nice and muted image from that. But I'll probably maybe go halfway, so maybe -60. And the same with whites, I'll probably do the same, kind of around -60. In a way, it kind of gives you like a nice blank canvas because you don't have a lot of harsh highlights and shadows to deal with, which is very helpful. And then for the shadows, there isn't that many harsh shadows here, but I might go even a tiny bit more here, plus 35, blacks, plus 30 maybe as well. That's maybe a bit too. Actually, yeah, I'll go maybe plus 40. And the reason for that is that I usually want to go a bit with contrast. And once you start adjusting contrast, you do add the blacks back into the image. What I also like to do is use the dehaze. So with the dehaze, I might just go a tiny bit like that. And it's kind of the same as contrast, but I feel like it doesn't affect the colors as badly because sometimes with contrast, the colors can go a bit icky. So I usually do the haze first, and then if I need to go further in with the contrast, I just do that instead. So now that I have this, I might go with the contrast. That looks really nice. I actually really like it. Straight away, you can see the difference, you know, with just a few settings. It makes a huge difference. Okay, once I have that, I sometimes also add some texture. She has a pretty good skin texture, so sometimes it's nice to add a bit more to kind of get more of those details in. Yeah, so now we have like a nice intense image. As you see, the colors are quite intense in this one, so we might actually go down on vibrance a tiny bit. Maybe -15. yeah, I find like this is nice. It brings it down a tiny bit. It's not as crazy. Okay, once we have that, I usually leave this curve here. You can work with it if you want to, you don't have to. I usually leave it alone because I'm working with the highlights and shadows. Next thing that I would usually do is go into color. I usually adjust my skin tones ever so slightly, maybe darken them depending on situation. I change the greens sometimes a tiny bit, so we'll just do that. I usually start with the skin tone first. I find like it's the most important thing for me to get right in the first place. And then after that, I will deal with anything like the background or the clothes or whatever. Obviously here we don't have any clothes, but you get the point. So I'm going to go into hue. I usually like my hue to be a tiny bit more on the redder side. So maybe I go like -5, -6. It's usually very subtle. I don't really go extreme in any of those cases. Then I might bring the saturation down a tiny bit. I do like the skin quite muted and neutral. And then sometimes I go slightly darker. Although here, I don't kind of know. I kind of feel like having the skin lighter is actually nice, because our model on the day was pretty pale, and I just don't think that it will make sense to change that too much because it just wouldn't look right. Okay, once we have that, I will go into yellows. So sometimes if you're working with leaves or anything like that, sometimes a lot of them are controlled by the yellow tones instead of the green tones, obviously because of the undertones and so on. So sometimes it's worth going into the yellows first before you go to the greens. So let's see here. So as you see here, it's not really the case as much. You can see a tiny bit in the water and where the skin is. There's a bit more reflection, so you can kind of decide which tones you want. I don't want it to be too green to be honest. So I think I'll stick on the warmer side of the hue spectrum just to have it there. And then lower the saturation or not. I'll just leave it as it is, I think. And then with the light, I don't really want too much light, so maybe I'll bring it down a tiny bit, maybe -10. Okay, then moving on to the green colors. So this is the leaves that we're going to be dealing with. So I think I'm gonna go, I really love this saturated, almost acid kind of green. I think it looks very well. However, I do realize that it looks very fake. So I will bring down the saturation of it. And by bringing down the saturation, it makes it a bit more realistic. It's still not very realistic, but it looks much more real. And then we can play with the highlights. I think just leaving it where it is, it's fine. Then aqua, it will probably affect the water the most, or maybe not at all. I don't really see if it affects anything, so that's fine. I'll just leave it as it is. Then blue, probably not much happening here. Yeah, very little, because it's mostly greens in the image. If you want to make the water look more turquoise, I would usually go towards the left side, and it makes it nice and turquoise and rich. You can boost the saturation or bring it down, but I think that's good. Next, I'm going to be dealing with highlights and shadows. Highlights and shadows are just something extra that I usually find brings this extra little something to the image, and I really like it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the saturation up first so I can see what I'm working with. And as you see here, we get some really crazy colors. But what I usually like to do is to bring a tiny bit of green, yellow undertones into my shadows, or sorry, into my highlights. So I would probably go into something like this, and then just lower it back down a tiny bit. And as you see, it gives this kind of almost slightly like a vintagey tone. I just really like it, and I think it works very well. And then next, so I have my saturation at 9. It's usually pretty low because the minute you put it up a tiny bit more, it just goes crazy. And the same with shadows. I'll just put the shadows up for a second, a tiny bit more. And I usually tend to go for slightly bit more bluish cold shadows, as I find it kind of balances my images quite well, considering I usually use quite warm tones in them. So again, I'll go here and just kind of see if it needs that. To be honest, I don't know. I mean, maybe a tiny bit, but I think I'm pretty happy with the way it looks. Okay, so that looks pretty well. And then maybe I'll just bring it down to 5 because I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, then we have sharpening, noise reduction, all this kind of stuff. Because I was shooting this with natural light and because I didn't have any crazy ISO or anything, it's not necessary. I would usually bring up the sharpness a tiny bit just because I want the image to be nice and crisp. So that looks pretty well. As I said, I have my profile lens correction fixed already. And then the final thing is the calibration that I sometimes do, not always. Sometimes I just leave it blank. But this is just something that I play around with just to see if the image needs anything. For example, this one, the -9 looks pretty good. I have to say, I'm really digging the colors. Okay, here it's making the skin tones a bit more yellow. I don't know, maybe it's tiny, but maybe like +2. It's very subtle because those ones are usually pretty drastic in changes. But I usually do find that sometimes if I'm not sure about certain colors, it's kind of nice to play around with those because they kind of help you see a slightly bit of a different look for your image. Okay, and then blue primary. It's actually quite nice if it's a bit more reddish, but not that reddish. Maybe -10. Maybe -7. That's pretty good. Okay, and then you can increase the saturation. Oh, that's actually pretty nice. Okay, maybe I'll increase the saturation a tiny bit. There we go. And that's pretty nice. Finally, if there's any final changes that I would do is I would probably go for this brush here and I would maybe add something extra into the eyes. This is obviously all pre-skin retouching. I will do skin retouching afterwards. This is completely unretouched at the moment. So for this one, I'll probably go a tiny bit higher with exposure, maybe add some highlights and whites, and then maybe some saturation because I want her eyes to be kind of nice and intense. So just do this, and then maybe add a bit of something to the eyes. I don't think it's necessary, to be honest. I'm pretty happy with how the image turned out. Okay, so this is it here. And then let's do it before and after. Now, if you want to save it as a preset, as you see, I have a lot of presets here. So if you want to save this as your preset, if that's something that you're working with, all you do is click plus, create preset. You will find a group, call it new presets, for example. You keep all of this selected and then you name it preset 1 or whatever you like to call it. And you click create and that's it. If you want to apply it on any other images, that's you done. Okay guys, that's it for today. Let me know what you think about the techniques. As you see, it's pretty straightforward. It's just about figuring out the right balance that works for your photos and for the mood that you're going for. Sometimes I like something a bit more contrasty and colorful and, you know, just a bit more poppy, and sometimes I just want something that is way more toned down. For this one, I really love the connection of her eyes and the greenery and the beautiful red lips, so I kind of wanted to put an emphasis on that, and you know, then her skin color connecting with the background of the house. So in general, I think that's the kind of vibes that I like, and I think it worked pretty well. But let me know what you think. If you did like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys next time.